afternoon and welcome from Boston. We're delighted that you're able to join us for a conversation that will involve music, memory, and art. This has evolved through friends living here in Boston who are connected with James Conlon, and we have been connected with Sam for more than half a century, so that the opportunity to share with you ideas about the world that was and regrettably the world that is. Dealing with music as one way, dealing with art as another, and combining them to think about how memory functions in conjunction with both of them. Sam and I have been working together and alongside one another for 54 years. It is have become for me an eternal joy simply to work together with him and his art, because the art itself allows us to engage with, I think, those fundamental issues that should make us human and offer us the opportunity to behave more humanly. So Sam, delighted that you are here. We're going to be sharing a number of your images related to the theme of music and the creation of music in the context of horror and destruction. James, if you'd introduce yourself, and then we'll begin.
Thank you, Bernie, if I may. And very pleased and honored and privileged to be with you today, because I am not an art person. I am not an artist. And in the hierarchy and food chain, I consider Sam much greater because he is a creator. I'm a classical musician. I'm a conductor. I've been a symphonic conductor. My only claim at this particular meeting is that I've been doing it for 50 years as of a month ago. So I guess I can qualify to be amongst you today. I have spent my life between symphonic conducting, operatic conducting, and choral conducting on both sides of the Atlantic. I started in the 1970s with a debut at the New York Philharmonic, and shortly after that at the Metropolitan Opera. I have long associations. I've been music director in Europe and lived there for over between 20 and 30 years, actually, including Paris, Cologne, Torino, Rotterdam, and I have been music director of the Cincinnati Music Festival, the oldest choral festival in America, as well as the Ravinia Festival, the summer home of the Chicago Symphony, and presently have been music director of Los Angeles Opera for the last 15 years. That's my day job. My extra mission, which is I think what has led me here by a circuitous route, is that I have a mission to bring the public attention and the attention of musicians the vast amount of music that was written by composers who were suppressed by the Nazi regime. And although much of this music is great, it has remained neglected even 75 years after the war. So I think that's where my dear friends Rumiko and Laurent Adamovich have brought me together with Sam and with you to share from my perspective, which is of course very different from your perspectives, but I think perhaps there's a conversation to be had. And that was all thanks to Rumiko and Laurent, who collaborated with me on a TED Talk, which deals with this subject.
Just as a side note, when the recording is released of this, we will also include a link to the TED Talk so that people will have access to that to enrich background that we're dealing with. Second, I would mention that the notion of being a musician certainly disqualifies me as well. I would not purport to sing today, so we're in good shape and we can then each do what we do best. I wanted to begin by suggesting that we start with a painting of Sam's and have that as the initial part of our exploration, both of what you have done and committed yourself to do beyond your day job, and what Sam's work has been focused on for the better part of 60 years, which is how we as human beings behave, what we do and what we don't do. And also, I hope that in the course of the discussion that we can also touch upon the world in which we are now living and watching daily in the Ukraine. So Rose, if we can look at the first image, I would appreciate it.
Well, my violinist, my violinist, it is very strange. People say that in Jewish families, the violin was very, very popular because a grand piano or even an upright piano is not something that you can take with you when you escape. So a violin is therefore a much more Jewish instrument. I somehow felt that there is the musician who holds the violin almost like a baby in his arms can let his soul express whatever it has. But I must say that we chose for this event some paintings with music, is to honor you, James. Since I discovered the world when I was about 5, 6, 7 years of age, and what was normal for me was war, were bombs, were horrors that were kind of normal. And then when I survived it, and when I arrived finally to a kind of a settled ground, I was 15. So actually all my terms of reference come from a world that has been destroyed, from walls that have been pierced by bullet holes. And in spite of all that, something remained in me, knowing that the walls can be destroyed, but the human spirit cannot. And this need to make the soul express itself and try to communicate with others is something that is embedded in even the wounded wall, which is, if you look well at this painting, the kind of echo of this musician. It also tells you that blood in art is only a red paint that is in a kind of a canister, and it has there a brush. We are very important for the human spirit, of course, but also very limited in what we can do. And the whole thing is suspended between hope of doing something, hoping to do something, and at the same time, feeling terribly frustrated how little we can affect what is going on.
James, you certainly have committed yourself to uncovering, recovering the creative efforts of so many during the period that Sam is referring to in his art. How would you respond to this painting, and how does it relate to your efforts?
Well, I'd like to just slightly riff on what Sam said. I think over my life, although I have been privileged to have not grown up in war conditions and in the presence of terrible cruelty and genocide that Sam grew up with, nevertheless, I've always pendulated between hope and despair as to the actual good that any of us classical musicians can actually do. I like to tell myself that we bring joy and enlightenment to people, and that music is a spiritual force, which I believe it to be. And therefore, we should try to shine whatever light we have at all times. But when we're confronted with, as we are today, with another war now in Ukraine, it's easy to ask yourself, well, is there any point what we're doing? We're not really being able to help anything. So between that despair and that going back to the belief that we have to do something, we each need to do whatever we can do. I go back to work, and because also work is my life and my joy, and that maybe that's self-centered, but it is what I love to do most of all. And I'm looking at this wonderful painting and thinking of, this man playing his violin. Is anybody listening to him? Maybe, maybe not. Is he just listening to himself? Is his message, if there is a message coming through, is it heard or is it lost? I would like to think that in my work, I'm trying to revive the works of artists who are neglected. Well, I should say musicians, music that is neglected as a result of the Nazi suppression. I like to feel that we are also performing an act of remembrance, and that act is incomplete. And in my view, that until those composers have found their place along with all of the other 20th century composers, and those also besides, Bach and Beethoven and Brahms, until they have found their place and their name recognition and at least a place in the sun, then my work will not be complete.
My guess is you certainly have a wish to live a long time, because there's a lot of work to do. In looking at this painting, Sam, for me, as you know, I have always stood in amazement, but especially in this one where the musician, as we look at it on the left, is seated on a bench of sorts, or a collapsible bench that he takes with him, and it is supported by an X, and the figure or the echo of the figure is also X'd out. It references for me this notion that both are contending with their own mortality, that they will eventually be X'd out. And all that really will remain as a form of witness or testimony is this painting of what was. So at least, James, with the music, if you are able to restore and recover parts of it, that music can be played again and again and again. This musician and his echo eventually disintegrate into memory. And I just add the quote from Brother Thomas, which does relate to most of the work, that memory is more permanent than matter. And so as we go through, hopefully that will be a guiding force for us, and looking at and listening to the music. So I think next, if it's okay, Rose, we can listen to a very short piece, and I think it is also delineated in the comments as to what it is.
So it'll play for about 45 seconds. So people at home, be sure your volume is up. And I also just wanted to encourage any viewers, if you have any questions, I'll sort of be monitoring the comment section. So feel free to chime in.
James, if you would talk a bit about that, and then we will be watching Sam's painting, which is one of the major works that we have ever had of his, with musicians as a theme, the Quartet for the End of Time. Please.
Well, I was struck by how many instruments, or I should say, how many string quartets seem to be in Sam's paintings, and so I think this is a good choice. Erwin Schulhoff, amongst the composers who were suppressed by the Nazis, is a very unique individual. Now, every story of those composers is different, Some knew each other, some were established, some were completely struggling artists. Schulhoff had a little bit of everything. He was a German-speaking Czech Jewish composer who was brought up in the German tradition, and took him several decades into his life before he really began to deal with his Czech roots in his music. And he passed through periods at the time of the First World War where he was a very disillusioned soldier, first trying out Dada, then moving on to jazz, which was a lifelong desire to wed jazz to the classical idiom. And then he became enamored of Marxism in the late 20s, and his compositions start to take on a missionary zeal of the Marxist cause. This was in a certain way his undoing, because he did obtain a visa to the Soviet Union to go to Moscow, and was collected immediately after Hitler's attack on Russia, and was therefore, being Jewish, was eventually sent to a concentration camp in Bavaria, where he died of tuberculosis in 1942. But he has a very special voice, and has left an enormous amount, particularly of chamber music, but also 6 completed symphonies, a lot of solo piano music, as he was a virtuoso pianist. But he captures the, I think, the theme of a struggling artist who was then stamped out, but whose music has managed to make it through and is gaining a larger and larger public today.
Sam, would you speak briefly or longer, if you would like, about the Quartet for the End of Time, namely the painting and some of the background for it?
Well, I painted it somehow in my memory to those wonderful conversations that I used to listen to of Messiaen, who was the composer of a quartet for the end of time that was certainly not written for strings, but just for the instruments that were available in the camp where he was a French war prisoner. But I must say that the quartet in itself, and I had some very good friends that were part of the Tel Aviv quartet that had a short life because they had to agree among them, and it didn't always work very well. But there is still something quite extraordinary in the quartet, which is this union of 4 individuals who can only create when they are doing something together. This is what amazes me when I see a symphony orchestra, for instance, because a painter's job is a very solitary job. It's always solitary. You're always alone in the studio, and then you paint for a person that will come and look at your painting, and there will again be one with one. And this is one of the reasons why I worked for the theater for many years, because I felt that I also wanted to be part of something which is greater than my own self. And this is my fascinations with groups of musicians that create suddenly something that is, for me, akin to a miracle.
That's amazing. Well, having dealt with some 150 artists over the period of time, most of whom worked by themselves, the goal of the gallery was to bring as many of them together on a social basis, so that some of the isolation that allows for the creation also becomes a way of collaboration and of sharing of both points of view, questions, and answers. This particular painting is extraordinary, both in size, scale, and I think for those who are viewing at it, looking at it, notice the musicians themselves have been transformed into wood, into concrete, into stone. Some are dressed, one of them in the center with part of a cello has the stripes of the prisoner's garment and the bow tie, so that there are all these sort of contradictions that even the notion of a quartet placed in nature And then to the right of it, clearly, that they have come with their suitcase. And certainly one of the vivid memories of my visit to Theresienstadt or Terezin were the suitcases that Jews brought there, for the most part, filled with whatever they felt they needed to bring with them. There's a kind of unraveling of the ball of yarn, which also becomes the serpent in the Garden of Eden. There are a whole range of associations, and at the same time, they're placed in some of the most beautiful nature. As you look off a very beautiful European landscape with the river pulling your eye way to the back, and then reminding you when you come to the foreground that there are many realities, one of which is brokenness and memory. Rose?
There is always, I also wanted to suggest that the measuring stuff there has the shape of the yellow Jewish Star of David, which is the kind of how you measure individuals. You're a Jew, therefore you belong there. You are not a Jew, you belong there. You are black, go away there. I mean, all these measuring things of humanity are present in our lives. And,
it's important that you mention that. I don't think many people have folding rulers any longer, Sam. So it also probably dates all of us.
And it was only the folding ruler that helped me to suggest the yellow star that I, as a child, remember had to stick to my front and my back because that's how we were allowed to get into the street.
No, absolutely. Rose, if we can listen to the next piece, thank you. James, you look good in a tux also, so please, and we'll be watching accidental music at the same, while you're speaking.
That very, very, very short clip came from a recent performance in Cologne, Germany, with the orchestra with whom where I was music director for some 13 years between 1989 and 2002. And with whom I went on a journey of discovery of the music to which I refer to as recovered music, recovered voices, in the early 1990s. We started that journey together, recorded a lot of music, and Alexander Zemlinsky was the prime composer with whom we started. And that happened almost by accident. And I recount that tale, how that happens, in my TED Talk. Alexander Zemlinsky was, in my mind, one of the greatest of these composers whose music is now played much more often than it was in 1990 when I started. But we did record together all of his works for orchestra and 3 of his 8 operas. I returned recently, as I still do with great pleasure, to my old orchestra there, and we brought back this particular piece, the Sinfonietta, which after Zemlinsky had fled the Nazis twice, the first time from Berlin and the second time from Vienna, came to New York and lived on the west side of Manhattan, briefly, already a certain age and already in ill health. Only one piece of his was played during his last few years, and it was conducted by Dmitri Metropolis with the New York Philharmonic on a radio broadcast. And it was this very Sinfonietta of which you just heard a very short excerpt.
And Sam, this is more than a quartet.
Well, this is a variation actually on the other painting. And you can recognize here some things which were in the other painting. Some have disappeared, some others. For me, this kind of red, this red is also the thread that helps us to get out from a labyrinth of some kind. This is already going towards an orchestra, engaging more and more remains of individuals, but it has very much to do with what memory represents for me, because memory represents for me bits and pieces of certain things that existed that we try to put together in some way. It is always a recreation. It is never something that is returning to us in the same way every time. And this is a very fascinating thing. You can evoke it in so many ways. So I'm very glad that you saw these two variations. I thought of music on the whole is for me the fascination with variations on a given theme.
James, do you have any thoughts about the painting in terms of the music we just heard, or the music that you continue to recover?
Well, I'm fascinated, honestly, with Sam and with your paintings, and I'm beginning to get to know a little bit of your vocabulary. And you know, we speak different languages, of course, and my relationship to the music that I am performing or hoping to get other people to perform is the same as any other composer. I don't conduct the works of Zemlinsky, of Schulhoff, or some of the other composers who were suppressed, like Franz Schreker, like Victor Ullmann, who was in Terezin, Walter Braunfels. I don't conduct their music any different than I would that of Brahms or Beethoven. My approach is the same. I have to surrender my ego to the spirit of the music and try to understand it and try to perform it as if it were the composer. Now, we actually have an impossible task. We can't understand what the composer thought, felt, wanted. We have an imperfect medium to study, which is a piece of paper with notes written on it. But the music doesn't stop with the notes. The music starts with the notes, and we have to go off on our own. And my artistic credo is such that we go off best on our own when we leave ourselves behind in the process. So I'm not a creative artist, and that's why I have such respect and awe of creative artists like Sam, who you know, can create this and make so many associations and allow us to have our own associations. Then this is a particular, I find this one particularly poignant, especially because, well, a little bit because those musicians on the side there, they seem to be, you know, busts, statues that, like the artifacts from the Roman Empire or the Greeks. All that's left, not even the torso is there, just the head. And I like that very much. It's very touching. And then as you go back the line, on the opposite side, you're going almost back to the emptiness of the face that's missing and the line that seems to go back, to me, into eternity.
Yeah, no, well, if I can just remark that you are receiving material that you interpret, and it seems to you, maybe when you interpret it according to your concept, that you always wonder what is it that the artist knew exactly what he wanted. But I really wonder if an artist ever knows what he really wants. For me, when I paint, I'm just searching. I wonder what it is that the painting wants and what it wants from me. And I try also very much to reduce my ego and say, well, I will see, I will try, I will try to understand, and at a certain point, I will leave it where it is a kind of a mystery, even to me.
Part of the joy, Sam, of this particular piece is to know, one, that it is an extension of a variation of the Quartet for the End of Time, and therefore has more characters in it. But nonetheless, your vocabulary of the instruments in a state of brokenness, for example. And then I assume, based upon your having photographs, I think the Hawthorne Quartet, that most of this positioning of the hands and of the instruments relate to where they would have been if these were real musicians. So going back and forth between the reality of the quartet playing and then these remnants of musicians, again placed in a very enigmatic landscape, continues to also, and I need to go back to this, remind me and others that it's still a painting. So the introduction of the color throughout it, very sharp, particularly with the cloth coming out of the suitcase, and then the yarn going across it, adds a kind of rhythm, if you will, to the entire scene and makes it quite extraordinary. I'm going to ask Rose to put up the piece Da Capo and ask both of you to respond to it, because it certainly represents for me what so many of the museums that exist now as a memorial to reminder of the Holocaust have in terms of piles of objects or shoes. And here we have a very different pile to deal with. So James, this is not necessarily your thing, but I would love you to respond to the image of the quartet and the mounds that, in a sense, fill the landscape.
Well, first, as a musician, the term da capo is a common one for us, coming from Italian, of course, and means to go back to the head or to go back to the beginning. And it was commonly used in the Baroque and classical periods, where you would play a certain part of a composition, and then you were instructed to return to the beginning again. So we're very familiar with that term. And I'm curious what made Sam choose it for this particular painting. So my associations here are, as you said, those piles that became symbolic of the loss of personal property, of the clothes of the victims of the genocide. But I see the quartet is not looking at each other. Their backs, as if they're each in their each way isolated, they continue on, but they're not able to look at each other. And as I look at that, the pile, and then back, da capo perhaps, I see those mountains, and they all remind me of the Tower of Babel of Bruegel, which I used to see so often in my years living in Holland in various forms. And even today, saw recently again in Vienna and at the museum. But it reminds me that the Babel, what is the story and the tragedy of Babel is that we're all on this earth, but we're talking different languages and we're unable to communicate with each other. That's the punishment of the tour of the Tower of Babel, and that reflects itself, I think, in these four musicians who are they're playing, but they're not looking at each other, and maybe they're not hearing each other. And da capo, well, it seems to go off into the far distance, but that's me looking at it as a total amateur. Sam, I don't know if that corresponds at all with what you're feeling.
Well, for me, this was maybe the painting of the most tragic moment in which even the instruments are taken away from these musicians. They have no violence in their hand. They simply repeat from the beginning a certain movement. They don't even have a proper bow. They just have kind of little branches that they have picked up. And I have chosen for it da capo. Of course, I knew what it meant in musical terms, also because the word capo has a certain assonance with Auschwitz, with people ruling over other people, with prisoners being forced to torture other prisoners. So this da capo and capo have evoked in me something quite scary. And I thought to place all that in nature, which is so very indifferent to what is going on, to what man can do. And when I painted that, the da capo was also for me an expression of a fear that the terrible thing that happened 70, 80 years ago can happen again, can start from the very beginning. And I think that today, with what we witness in Ukraine, and we don't even know how this is going to end and where it is going to lead the entire world, suddenly this da capo becomes very frightening.
A perfect opportunity in a way to look at one of the paintings from the present exhibition at the gallery called The End of War in a minute, but also to remind ourselves of having gone to these various museums and seen over and over again the piles of shoes, the possessions. There was an exhibit in Prague called Precious Legacy, which was a collection of instruments, Torah scrolls, books that Jews had owned that were brought together to eventually create a museum for the people who no longer existed, who had been destroyed in the context of the goals of Wannsee and the elimination of the Jews from the world. So there's an enormous number of resonances in that one painting that I think everyone can bring to it, but it is that of loss. And then now to look at the most recent exhibition and this painting called The End of War brings it even more to our minds that people, humankind, just don't seem to get it. The need for us to continue to dominate, to destroy, with no sense of limitation, with no sense of the value of human life, is, if nothing else, disheartening. And I know that we're talking about music and art, as James mentioned at the very beginning, as the potential to be uplifting and hopeful. So rather than end with this, I thought it made sense so that we can get it out of the way and then be depressed and then move back to the art. So Sam, if you could talk a bit about it, and then we can come back to James. Even though, James, this is not part of the script, I would appreciate your thoughts as well.
Well, my thought about it when I painted it was also somehow related to the destruction of the planet, because it is not only those enormous stacks that can be related, of course, to the crematorium and those millions of incinerated bodies that sent out into the sky, but it is an ongoing process of destruction of our world that we are producing. So when I painted all of that, I painted this landscape of great catastrophe and this very quiet conversation that goes on between people, and a kind of a sense of an acceptance of we don't like it, but what can we do? And from time to time, it kind of shakes me up, and I feel that maybe we do not do enough.
James?
Well, I'm thinking two things. One is an irony that the line, "the war is over," is an important moment in its English translation of the opera by Victor Ullmann, which was written in Terezin, which was called Der Kaiser von Atlantis, the Kaiser of Atlantis, and is one of the remnants from probably the composer who wrote more in any concentration camp than any other. Victor Ullmann went into Terezin in 1942 and was on one of the last transports to Auschwitz, where he was murdered, left behind 22 compositions, which were stored by a friend and eventually came to light in London in the 70s. And this opera, which takes an hour, was to be performed, but was canceled. We don't know the circumstances, whether the Nazi authorities saw it and recognized veiled references to Hitler in it, or just simply Ullmann himself thought he could get into trouble. We don't know why it was canceled, but it was never performed. But it ends or close to the end, there is a quote, "The war is over," and the title character reflects on war destruction. I think unfortunately, the war is never over. Unless human beings learn what they clearly have not learned enough, we have clearly not learned enough, is that war, destruction, cruelty are our enemy, and that if we don't learn to behave otherwise, the human life on this planet is doomed. Now, whether that will happen in a terrible way, in a dramatic way, with the presence of nuclear weapons, or whether we simply will be so insensitive to the needs of the environment that the planet will change in such a way that eventually, in the next 100 years, it will become uninhabitable for many people. These are great challenges for humanity, because we clearly try to learn, we try to make progress, and perhaps we do very slowly, looked over the course of centuries. But when we see the horrors of the last few weeks, it's clear that we're not there yet, and we have to get there. This striking painting by Sam is very powerful, and those are my very spontaneous reactions to seeing it.
Very much so. The issue that Sam raised about the environment is dealt with in an essay recently by our son called Truth Tellers, which is essentially the individuals alerting artists and writers and thinkers, all of us, to the potential destruction of the planet. And so where in all of this does music and art play a role, if it does at all? We can look at the next painting and think about it. We can continue to look at this, but that seems to me to be one of the underlying questions, as both of you are engaged full-time in creating either art or music, and appreciating it, and somehow I would believe feeling that it can make a difference.
So I've added another piece of music that we'll listen to just a little bit longer.
Okay. And then we'll go back to my question, give them some time to think about it. Good idea,
Yeah.
Rose. Okay. And now, James, do you want to talk a bit about the music? Then we can look at the painting a bit, and then we can go back to the other question.
Right. I can that very brief excerpt. I have a reaction on an objective scale and then also on a personal scale. So that's a recording of an intermezzo by Franz Schreker that was written in the late 1890s. Franz Schreker, another victim of the Nazis. And that beautiful piece won him the beginning of his career, which was to be very, very successful for several decades. I think it shows you the link of the composers that go all the way back to the last decade of the 19th century, right up until the 1930s and the 1940s. I'm slightly bemused when I see that on the YouTube, because that's the cover of a recording that I made with the orchestra, the Gürzenich-Orchester in Cologne, which I made for EMI. But in a certain way, that title page expresses something that happened also through the Nazi era. You'll see that my name does not appear on that with those of the other conductors, because for some reason, whoever made those decisions at EMI chose to leave it off. This is a good example. I mean, I suspect I know the background a little bit, but I was actually surprised when I saw it. This is a little bit of an expression of that there are persons who are in favor and those out. As Sam pointed out, you're here, you're a Jew, so that's where you go. You're not a Jew, you go here. So I think it's a little interesting that to see on a recording that to some degree concentrates on a very important composer whose name was at least momentarily rubbed out by the Nazis, that this modern day artifact shows that the same kind of thinking still exists in today's world. Is it important for me? No, not at all. Important thing for me is that the music gets played and our voices are heard. But I find it an irony in the context of this conversation, which is about names that disappeared, that it reverberates a little bit with that experience.
Interesting as you mentioned that, because I was looking at the dust cover or the record cover and looking for your name and wondering why it wasn't there. So thank you very much for highlighting that, because it didn't make sense to me. And then the earlier conversation about erasing people's names from anyone's awareness is certainly part of what we need to be concerned about going forward as well. And then the painting that we were looking at, Sam.
Yes, a rooftop. The boy of the ghetto of Warsaw lifting up his arms and becoming the fiddler on the roof. There is an incredible stereotyping about the lost Jewish civilization in Europe, which has been very much helped by the musical Fiddler on the Roof. And very many Jews, even here, are, I'm sorry, my telephone is misbehaving. I wanted to say that there is an irony, of course, in that, and it's a painful irony, but irony helps us also to get a perspective of things. And this painting is part of a series of paintings that are dedicated to this boy, you know, with the arms up in this famous photograph, because at that time, I looked exactly like the boy. I was that age, I had that kind of coat, and I was given this incredible gift of, if I'm there next year, becoming 90. So that is absolutely extraordinary, and somehow allowing me to spend my life speaking of things that must be remembered, So I don't know. I think I should stop speaking about it because I can go on like this for hours.
No, Sam, but then let's go back to the question. Rose, if you go back to the capo, we can just have it on the screen and ask both Sam and James if they would engage a bit with the notion of, maybe naive notion, that art and music can and should make a difference in the world we're living in today.
It makes a great difference to the artists, because as James said before, he goes back to work, and I work every day. And I think that if art is created in the time of the Holocaust, writers wrote, the great Jewish poet Suskever wrote in the time of the ghetto, in the time that he was a slave laborer and so on, innumerable, most beautiful poems that have ever been created in the Yiddish language. So creation and art save certainly very much the makers. And I don't think that the interpreters of music are less creative than the inventors, because the interpreters of music, they bring life to what is written in, for people who don't know music, in a very mystical and unreadable signs on paper. It doesn't mean anything. So art saves the artists, but if it transforms the world, that's another question. I have no answer for.
I love hearing you say that, Sam, because of course I feel that save the artist. I feel my life has been enriched, not just enriched, saved by my passion for music, and it has motivated me since my 11th year, totally, and still does today. But or if we're doing any good, I would like to think we are, but I'm not. I'm not convinced. On a bad day, I'm not convinced. On a good day, I say, well, maybe it does do something. But we can't do otherwise. I think you're the same. You say you work every day. I work every day because I cannot do otherwise. That's my nature. I think the biggest issue is we're doing something as musicians that disappears with the recordings. Okay, it stays, but we make a performance, it's gone the next morning, and you have to start from zero in a certain way. You're as good as your last performance, people are fond of saying. So you have to keep reinvesting day after day after day, not having any idea if it makes any real difference in the world, and yet we do it, and that's what we've been made to do. We're created for this. I don't think we can help ourselves.
No, we cannot.
It is in many ways a calling for both of you and for so many who continue to devote their lives to both art or music. And just on a small aside, the gallery remains for me the vehicle to be able to share both. And I'm not positive, as both of you have said, whether it makes a difference in the grand scheme of things, but it certainly does on a sort of small incremental basis for those who are touched by the music, touched by the art, to be able to find a place where this kind of conversation is welcome. And it is, I hope, out of these kinds of conversations that people are made more aware of their capacity individually to certainly make a difference in the nature of the world in which we are living. And that the events in the future will not create needs or situations that prompt the paintings that Sam has continued to paint, specifically in this exhibition, but throughout the past 60 years. There's one last piece that work of art that goes back many, many years in Sam's life and creative life that it seemed fun to sort of look at the end of the conversation. Sam?
Yes, well, I painted it when I was 22, 23, 24. I think I painted it in Paris when I was a student of art. And this has to do certainly with my beginnings, where I very much believe in contemporary art, in forms of contemporary art. And I went on into more and more abstraction, more and more dealing with shapes, forms, with the stuff that makes art. And then little by little, I became convinced that what matters enormously is the content, And I wanted to communicate, therefore, from this thing, which is, of course, it's a group of people that walk. I called it the musicians because I felt that they are carrying with them some instruments. I really don't know what instruments and so on. But then I turned into a language where I picked up from the classical painting the stuff that says directly and immediately about something about the content of the painting. And the content became for me very, very important, without giving up, of course, on the form, on the discipline of the forms. And I always thought, I somehow felt very very close to Bach, who in his time was considered almost old-fashioned. And today, the question of fashion and what is exactly contemporary, not contemporary, doesn't matter very much, because it is, after all, something, the timelessness of the content that touches us mostly. So I think.
Sam, I couldn't be more thrilled to hear you say that about Bach, but because I think this is one of the great, I would say, cliches or banalities of conversations in classical music about, is something relevant today or because it's old-fashioned? And by definition, what it has become classical is something that has traveled through time and space into a transcendence that is relevant at all times. And if we fail to see its relevance, that's our problem, our fault, not the fault of music. I just happen to be conducting the St. Matthew Passion in the next 10 days and have this very much on my mind, that the Bach, as you said, was considered old-fashioned, old hat. And it's no importance today who was avant-garde and who was not. That's only interesting, maybe at best, at the moment that it is created or performed in public. And so that people can argue about it. The partisans of both sides can say, it's not modern, it's not avant-garde, it should be. Others should say it shouldn't be. The fact is, it's irrelevant at the distance of a week, a month, a day, a century, 2 centuries. Art is, the great art is there forever. And Sam, your art is in that category, I think.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more with you, not about my art, but about all you said before, about the relevance of
And I think that really is the reason that wanted the two of you together for a brief time, not to admire one another's ideas or art, but rather to understand. Rose, if we could go back one time to accidental music, and we'll end with that unless you have some very, very strong questions. Thank you. Because it is, and when we did our first show of Sam's work in 1968, the 2 newspapers that reviewed it were the MIT newspaper and the Harvard Crimson, both of whom wrote and said, this is the strongest contemporary art that we have ever seen shown. And the reality is, it's because it is eternal at the same time, that the questions that Sam is asking and the questions that the St. Matthew Passion will be asking are essentially about our humanness and the potential in each and every one of us to realize that for the good rather than for the bad. Hopefully, the conversation today will have been not only informative, but I think provocative enough for all of us to continue to engage those issues, those questions, and make this a slightly better world. So thank you all so much. James, Sam, as ever. Rose, thank you as well. And thank you everyone for being with us. Look forward to seeing you.
Thank you.
It was great.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.